The Grand Elysian Hotel was not a place of noise. It was a cathedral of quiet wealth, a sanctuary where the rustle of $1,000 bills was the prevailing hymn. Marble floors, polished to a dark, liquid gleam, reflected the cold, diamond-like glitter of crystal chandeliers that hung from the frescoed ceiling like constellations of frozen stars. The air itself seemed expensive, thick with the scent of aged leather from the lobby armchairs and the faint, clean perfume of lilies that were replaced twice daily. It was a silence bought and paid for, a deliberate hush that amplified the importance of those who inhabited it. At the heart of this opulent stillness stood a grand piano. It was a magnificent Steinway, its ebony finish so deep and lustrous it seemed to drink the light from the room. It was not an instrument for playing. It was an object of art, a silent testament to the hotel's prestige. Its keys, a perfect, untouched smile of ivory and obsidian, had not felt the touch of a musician in years. It was a centerpiece, a monument, much like the wealthy patrons who drifted through the lobby like ghosts in tailored suits. Alistair Finch was one such patron, though he was no ghost. He was a creature of immense gravitational presence. He sat in a wingback chair as if it were a throne, his suit a razor-sharp cut of charcoal gray that probably cost more than the car the doorman drove. On his wrist, a platinum watch gleamed, its mechanics a tiny, intricate engine of Swiss precision that measured time in increments Alistair felt he owned. His face was a mask of bored aristocracy, with eyes the color of a winter sky, and a mouth set in a permanent, thin line of casual contempt. He looked upon the world not as a participant, but as a spectator at a mediocre play he had been forced to attend. Alistair's thoughts moved like sharks in a barren sea. He catalogued the worth of everything he saw. The chandelier, $250,000. The Persian rug, 80,000 at least. The simpering junior executive across from him, laughing too loudly at a joke Alistair had not found funny. A liability. Wealth to Alistair was not a comfort. It was a weapon and a fortress. It was the high, cold wall he had built around himself, brick by painful brick, to keep the world and its messy, impoverished emotions at bay. His fortune was a glacier, and he was the frozen heart within it. Drifting at the periphery of this frozen world was Elias Vance. He was the hotel's night janitor, a figure so seamlessly blended into the background that he had become functionally invisible. His uniform was a simple gray affair, worn but immaculately clean. His hands, though reddened and calloused from years of labor, moved with a quiet, deliberate grace as he pushed a polishing machine over the endless expanse of marble. His hair was silver at the temples, and his back was slightly stooped, not from age, but from a weight that seemed to settle on his very soul. In his eyes there was a profound and ancient sadness, a hollowed-out space where a great fire had once burned. Elias did not think of the wealth around him. To him, the chandeliers were just lights that needed dusting, the rugs just surfaces that trapped dirt. His mind was a quiet place, filled with the simple litany of his tasks and the ghost of a melody he could never quite shake. He worked to keep the memories at bay, to tire his body so his mind would grant him the mercy of sleep. He was a man who had lost his world, and now spent his nights polishing the floors of another, a world to which he would never belong. His tragedy was his own silent, private possession, the only thing of value he had left. He moved around the grand piano, his reflection a fleeting, hunched shape on its polished flank, a man utterly divorced from the beauty and power locked within the silent instrument. Alistair's gaze, sweeping the room for some distraction, some flaw to latch onto, snagged on the janitor. He watched the old man's slow, methodical work, and a familiar, ugly feeling began to stir within him. A venomous mix of boredom and disdain. This man, this creature of mops and buckets, was an affront to the curated perfection of the space. He was a symbol of the grime Alistair had spent his entire life escaping. He leaned forward, a cruel spark igniting in his icy eyes. His companions, a small flock of younger businessmen who orbited him like nervous moons, fell silent, sensing a shift in their son's gravitational pull. "Julian," Alistair said, his voice a low, smooth drawl that cut through the lobby's hush. He gestured with his chin toward a nervous young man in a suit that was trying too hard. "You want to impress me? You want to be a part of my world?" Julian practically vibrated with eagerness. "Yes, Mr. Finch, more than anything." Alistair's smile was thin as a paper cut. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger not at Elias, but at Julian, yet his gaze was fixed on the old janitor moving near the piano. "I'll give you $50,000, he announced, his voice rising just enough to capture the attention of the surrounding tables. "Cash. Right now. If you go over there and make that old beggar humiliate himself for our entertainment." The lobby, already quiet, became unnaturally still. The low murmur of conversation died. The clinking of glasses stopped. Every eye turned, first to the imperious billionaire, then to the terrified young executive, and finally to the unsuspecting janitor. The air crackled with a sick, voyeuristic tension. Julian paled. He looked from Alistair's cold, expectant face to Elias, who was now carefully wiping down the base of a marble column, oblivious. The young man was caught in a brutal trap. The lure of a life-changing sum of money and the approval of a titan weighed against a simple act of profound cruelty. Alistair watched Julian's hesitation with amusement. He thought of the world as a simple equation. Everyone had a price. Dignity was just a commodity, and a poor man's dignity was the cheapest of all. He was not just offering a bet. He was proving a point about the fundamental nature of humanity. Julian swallowed hard, his ambition warring with the last vestiges of his decency. The $50,000 shimmered in his mind's eye, a golden key to the life he craved. The laughter and respect of Alistair Finch seemed in that moment more valuable than the quiet dignity of a stranger. He stood up, his movements stiff. The eyes of the crowd followed him like the tracking lenses of a dozen cameras. They were a silent jury, some horrified, some morbidly curious, but all of them complicit in their stillness. Their collective gaze was a spotlight, isolating Elias in the center of a stage he did not know he was on. Julian approached Elias, his steps faltering on the gleaming marble. "Excuse me," he began, his voice barely a whisper. Elias turned, his expression one of mild, professional courtesy. "Yes, sir? Is there something I can help you with?" Julian couldn't meet his eyes. He gestured vaguely toward the opulent lobby. My boss," he stammered, pointing back at Alistair, who was watching with a predatory calm. "He has a proposition." But Alistair had grown impatient with the boy's weakness. He stood and walked toward them, his expensive shoes making no sound on the floor. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. He stopped before Elias, looking down at him as if he were an insect. "Let's dispense with the middleman," Alistair said, his voice dripping with condescension. He looked Elias up and down, taking in the worn uniform, the tired lines on his face. "You, old man, you see that piano? Elias's gaze followed Alistair's gesture to the magnificent Steinway. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his sad eyes. "Yes, sir. It's a beautiful instrument." A cruel laugh, dry as rustling paper, escaped Alistair's lips. "Beautiful," he echoed mockingly. "I'm sure it is. Here's the deal." He raised his voice again, performing for his audience. "I will give you $100,000. 100,000. If you go over there right now and play us a song." The crowd gasped. The stakes had been raised. It was no longer about proxy humiliation. It was a direct, impossible challenge. The offer was absurd, a public mockery disguised as a wager. The implication was clear. A man like this, a cleaner, could no more play that piano than he could fly. The attempt would be a pathetic, fumbling spectacle. That was the humiliation Alistair was paying for. Elias stood frozen. The world around him seemed to recede, the faces of the wealthy onlookers blurring into a gallery of mocking masks. He felt the familiar weight of invisibility, but now it was paired with the hot sting of public shame. He was not a person to them. He was a prop in a rich man's cruel game. His first instinct was to shrink away, to murmur an apology and disappear back into the shadows where he belonged. It was the path of least resistance, the one he had walked for years, but then, as Alistair's contemptuous smile bored into him, something shifted deep within Elias. A memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through the fog of his grief. It was his daughter, Lily, her small face alight with joy as her fingers danced across the keys of their piano at home. "Promise me, Daddy," she had said, her voice a melody in itself. "Promise me you'll never stop playing. Not ever. The music is you." He had broken that promise. The day he lost her, the music had died inside him. He had locked it away in the deepest, most fortified chamber of his heart, convinced he no longer deserved it. But now, this man's arrogance, his casual cruelty, was a chisel chipping away at the stone of that chamber. Alistair watched the old man's internal struggle with a predator's patience. He saw the flicker of pain, the bowed head. He was about to win. The janitor would scurry away, and Alistair would have proven his point. Money and power were the only truths, but Elias did not scurry. He straightened his back. The stoop that had been etched there by years of sorrow seemed to lessen. He lifted his chin and, for the first time, looked directly into Alistair Finch's cold, winter sky eyes. There was no anger in his gaze, no defiance. There was only a vast, quiet stillness, a sorrow so deep it resembled strength. "All right," Elias said, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent lobby. He said only that one word. Alistair was taken aback for a fraction of a second. He had expected begging or fleeing, not acceptance. A smirk quickly replaced his surprise. This was even better. The fool was actually going to do it. The humiliation would be exquisite. "Excellent," he boomed. "Let the concert begin." Laughter rippled through parts of the crowd, a nervous, ugly sound. Elias turned away from Alistair. He did not look at the crowd. He walked toward the Steinway grand piano with a slow, measured tread. Each step was heavy, a pilgrimage across a desert of grief. The world saw a janitor approaching an expensive piece of furniture he had no right to touch. But inside Elias's mind, he was walking toward the last remaining piece of his daughter's soul. He reached the piano bench and paused, running a calloused hand over the flawless, polished wood. He sat down. The posture was all wrong for a janitor. It was perfect. His back was straight, his shoulders relaxed. He placed his hands, the hands of a laborer, over the keys, but he did not press them. He just held them there, hovering over the silent ivory. The silence in the room stretched, becoming taut and unbearable. Alistair crossed his arms, a smug, expectant look on his face. Julian, the young executive, looked physically ill. Then Elias played. It began with a single note. Just one. It was not loud, but it filled the entire cavernous space, pure and clear as a drop of water in a silent cave. It hung in the air, shimmering with an emotion so profound it made the heart ache. Then another note joined it, and another. And suddenly a melody bloomed in the opulent air, a melody of impossible beauty and unbearable sadness. It was not the clumsy, fumbling tune everyone had expected. This was the music of a master. The notes flowed from his fingers not as a performance, but as a confession. The music spoke of love, a love as bright and brilliant as a sunrise. It built into a crescendo of joy, painting pictures of laughter and sunlight in the minds of all who listened. The crowd was frozen, their mocking smirks and pitying glances wiped away, replaced by expressions of stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. Then the music shifted. The joy fractured, collapsing into a cascade of dissonant, frantic chords that spoke of sudden, violent tragedy. It was the sound of a world breaking apart, of a sky falling. The melody that remained was a lament, a long, weeping cry of pure, unadulterated loss. It was the sound of a heart being hollowed out, of a promise broken. It was so personal, so raw, that it felt like an intrusion to even listen to it. People in the crowd began to weep silently, strangers united in a moment of vicarious, overwhelming grief. Alistair Finch stood rooted to the spot. His smugness had evaporated, leaving behind a stark, naked shock. The music was bypassing the high, cold walls of his fortress of wealth. It was pouring through the cracks, flooding the empty chambers of his heart with a feeling he had long ago buried. Pain. The melody was a key, unlocking a door in his own memory, a door he had sealed shut with gold and steel. He saw a little girl with bright eyes, his sister, her face pale on a cheap pillow, telling him she wished she could hear a piano just once before she... He flinched. He physically recoiled as if struck. Elias's eyes were closed, tears tracing paths through the dust on his cheeks. He was no longer in the Grand Elysian Hotel. He was back in his sunlit living room with Lily, her small hands guided by his. The sound of their shared laughter, the most beautiful music he had ever known. He was playing for her. He was playing his apology, his love, his unending sorrow. The final notes of the piece were not a grand finale, but a quiet, resigned whisper. The melody resolved into a single, soft chord that hung in the air for a long moment, like a soul reluctant to leave, before fading into absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence that returned to the lobby was different. It was no longer the cold, empty silence of wealth. It was a heavy, sacred silence, filled with the ghost of the music and the weight of a shared, profound human experience. The power dynamic had not just been inverted, it had been annihilated. In that room, there were no longer rich and poor. There was only a musician and his audience, all of them humbled by the power of his art. Alistair's face was a mask of utter confusion. His world, built on the simple, brutal arithmetic of money, had been shattered by something he could not quantify, could not buy, could not control. The janitor had not been humiliated. Alistair had. The silence was finally broken by a single person clapping. Slowly, tentatively, others joined in, until the entire lobby erupted in a thunderous, heartfelt ovation. It was not polite applause. It was a roar of gratitude, of awe, of emotional release. But the aftermath began before the applause even faded. A young woman in the corner, a social media influencer who had been live streaming her luxurious evening, had captured the entire event on her phone. The cruel challenge, the janitor's quiet acceptance, the transcendent performance. She had titled it simply, "A billionaire tried to humiliate a janitor. Instead, he silenced the world." She hit post. Within minutes, the video exploded online. It was shared tens of thousands of times, then hundreds of thousands. The hashtags #JanitorVirtuoso and #FinchFolly began to trend globally. Alastair Finch's name, once a symbol of untouchable power, was now inextricably linked to an act of petty public cruelty. His phone began to buzz incessantly, a furious hornet in his pocket. It was his PR team, his board members, his investors. The stock price of Finch Holdings, a monolithic pillar of the financial world, began to show a tremor, then a dip, then a sickening plunge. His reputation, a carefully constructed edifice of power and prestige, was crumbling in real time. Just as the chaos began to swirl around Alastair, a man of quiet authority emerged from a private elevator. It was Mr. Sterling, the owner of the Grand Elysian, a man whose wealth was old, discreet, and far deeper than Alastair's. His face, usually a pleasant mask of hospitality, was carved from granite. "Mr. Finch," Sterling said, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. He did not acknowledge the applause or the weeping patrons. His eyes were fixed on Alastair. "You have made a grave error in my establishment." But before Alastair could formulate a response, another voice cut through the air. "That piece," a woman said, stepping forward from the crowd. She was elegantly dressed, with an air of sharp intelligence. "I know that piece." All eyes turned to her. She was Geneviève Dubois, the world's most feared and respected music critic, a woman whose opinion could make or break careers. She had been dining in the hotel's Michelin-starred restaurant and had been drawn out by the impossible music. She walked toward the piano, her eyes filled with a look of reverence and disbelief. She did not look at Alastair. She looked only at Elias, who was still sitting on the bench, looking down at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "There are only a handful of people in the world who would even know of its existence," Dubois continued, her voice trembling slightly. "It is the Lament for a Lost Star, an unpublished and famously unplayable composition by the pianist Elias Vance, a piece he wrote after the tragic death of his daughter, just before he disappeared from the world over a decade ago." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Then she turned her gaze, sharp as a shard of glass, upon the stunned assembly. "That man," she declared, pointing a trembling finger at the janitor in the worn gray uniform, "is not a janitor. That man is Elias Vance." The name hung in the air, an explosion in the sacred silence. Elias Vance. The prodigy who had sold out concert halls from Vienna to New York. The genius who had walked away from it all at the height of his fame. He was a legend, a ghost story whispered among classical music aficionados. And he had been polishing floors. Alastair felt the ground beneath him disintegrate. It was not just a talented janitor he had tried to humiliate. He had tried to debase a living legend. The scale of his misjudgment was catastrophic. He was no longer just a bully. He was a Philistine, a barbarian who had used a Stradivarius as a fly swatter. The buzz in his pocket was now a continuous, frantic vibration. His empire was burning. Mr. Sterling motioned for his security team, who moved with silent, imposing efficiency. They did not approach Elias. Instead, they formed a respectful perimeter around the piano, shielding him from the sudden onslaught of reporters who were already beginning to swarm the hotel entrance. Sterling then walked over to Alistair. "My office, now," he commanded. It was not a request. Stripped of his audience and his arrogance, Alistair followed numbly. He was escorted past the stunned faces of his former sycophants, past the tear-streaked faces of the patrons, a fallen king being led from his court. The world he had so carefully built, a world governed by the cold, hard logic of money, had been undone by a song. Mr. Sterling's office was the antithesis of the lobby's cold grandeur. It was warm and personal, filled with old books, nautical maps, and the scent of pipe tobacco. It was the room of a man secure in who he was, not what he owned. Alistair felt small and exposed within its walls. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Elias Vance entered, no longer in his janitor's uniform but in a simple, clean shirt and trousers provided by the hotel. He moved with the same quiet dignity, but the crushing weight on his shoulders seemed to have lifted, replaced by a profound weariness. "Sit down, Elias," Sterling said gently. Elias took a seat in a worn leather armchair. He did not look at Alistair. The three men sat in silence for a long moment. Alistair's mind raced, trying to find a strategy, a way to leverage his wealth to fix this. But for the first time in his life, his money was useless. It was the source of his damnation, not his salvation. "I don't understand," Alistair finally croaked, the words tasting like ash. "Why? Why are you here, cleaning floors?" Elias finally raised his eyes. They were clear, holding no malice, only a deep, oceanic sorrow. "Because the music died," he said simply. "When I lost my daughter, the world lost its color, its sound. The silence was too loud. Being here, near the piano, even a silent one, was the only thing that made the silence bearable. I was polishing a tombstone." Alistair stared at him, and the music from the lobby echoed in his memory. The raw, unshielded pain of it. It had felt real because it was. He had mocked a man's sacred act of mourning, a wave of self-disgust, a feeling so foreign it was nauseating, washed over him. "That music," Alistair began, his voice cracking. It reminded me of something." He found himself speaking, the words spilling out of him, the confession tearing through the fortress he had spent a lifetime building. "I had a sister, younger than me. We grew up with nothing, dirt floors, never enough to eat. But she loved music. She would pretend our rickety kitchen table was a piano, humming tunes she'd heard on a neighbor's radio." He paused, his gaze distant, lost in a past he had tried to bury under mountains of gold. She got sick, an infection. It would have been nothing, a simple course of antibiotics. But we had no money. No money for a doctor, no money for medicine. She died, listening to me hum her favorite tune because it was all I could give her. A tear, hot and shocking, traced a path down Alistair's cheek. It was the first he had shed in 30 years. "I swore that day," he whispered, his voice thick with a lifetime of repressed grief. "I swore that I would never be powerless again. I would conquer money, so it could never conquer me. I came to hate poverty, to hate anything that reminded me of that weakness, that helplessness. When I saw you, an old man, poor, it was like looking at a ghost from a life I had clawed my way out of, and I hated you for it." Elias listened, his expression unchanged. The story was tragic, but it was a common one. The world was full of pain that twisted people into unrecognizable shapes. He felt a flicker of something, not quite pity, but a sad recognition of a kindred wound. "My daughter's name was Lily," Elias said quietly, his own confession offered in the heavy silence. "She was my world. She was the music. She was a prodigy. Her talent was a light that brightened everything. She was 7 years old." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded, creased photograph, handling it with the care of a priest handling a sacred relic. He slid it across the polished desk toward Alistair. It showed a little girl with bright, laughing eyes sitting at a piano, her small hands on the keys. Alistair looked at the photo, and his breath hitched. The girl's smile was a beacon. "She was killed," Elias continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, the story worn smooth by a million silent retellings in his own mind. "A car accident. A young man, rich and reckless, showing off his new sports car. He ran a red light. It was instantaneous. For her." Elias's gaze drifted to the window. "I lost everything in that moment. My life, my soul, my music. I couldn't touch a piano. It felt like a betrayal of her memory. So I disappeared. I gave up the name Elias Vance. I needed to be nobody. I needed to be invisible." He looked back at Alistair. "The accident was on October 12th, a decade ago." Alistair went rigid. His blood ran cold. The date. October 12th. The world tilted on its axis, and every sound in the room ceased to exist. His hand, trembling uncontrollably, went to the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out his own wallet, his fingers fumbling. From a hidden sleeve, he extracted a worn photograph, much like Elias's. It was a picture of his own sister, taken a week before she died. A frail girl with enormous, hopeful eyes. He placed it on the desk next to the photo of Lily. The resemblance was uncanny. Not identical, but a shared spirit seemed to shine from both faces, a love for life that had been extinguished too soon. But that was not the connection that made Alistair's heart stop. My nephew," Alistair stammered, his face ashen. "My estranged sister's son. He was a wild kid. He inherited a fortune from his father. On October 12th, 10 years ago, he wrapped his brand new Ferrari around a telephone pole. He was killed instantly." Elias stared at him, confusion clouding his features. Alistair's voice dropped to a choked, horrified whisper. "He had no other family. I was his sole heir. That inheritance, that blood money, was the foundation of my entire empire. The money that came from the car that killed your daughter." He looked from the photo of Lily to the photo of his own dead sister, and then to the face of the man whose life he had unknowingly destroyed twice over. "Is the money that made me Alistair Finch." The room was silent. The connection was not just fated, it was grotesque. It was a cosmic, cruel joke. Alistair's entire life, his fortress of wealth, was built upon the rubble of Elias Vance's world. The pain they shared was not just similar, it was the same pain. A single, horrific event that had created a monster and broken a genius. Alistair Finch broke. The sound that escaped him was not a cry, but a raw animal noise of utter desolation. He slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, the perfect suit rumpled, the mask of power shattered into a million pieces, revealing the broken, impoverished boy he had always been underneath. The revelation left Alistair a hollowed-out ruin of a man. For days he remained secluded, the viral video of his hubris playing on a loop in the court of public opinion, while the real, more terrible truth played on a loop in his soul. His empire, built on the currency of a child's death, felt like a curse, every dollar a stain on his hands. He was confronted with a choice, stark and absolute: to let his world and his spirit crumble into nothingness, or to find a path through the wreckage toward something resembling atonement. A week after the incident at the hotel, Alistair Finch called a press conference. The world expected a groveling, corporate scripted apology. What they witnessed was the public dismantling of a tycoon. He stood at the podium, not in a power suit, but in a simple dark sweater. He looked older, diminished, the arrogance gone from his eyes, replaced by a profound, haunting exhaustion. "There is no excuse for my actions at the Grand Elysian Hotel," he began, his voice steady but devoid of its former power. "My cruelty was a reflection of a poverty of spirit that no amount of money could cure." He then proceeded to do something unprecedented. He told them everything. He spoke of his sister, of his nephew, and without using Elias's name to protect his privacy, he spoke of a great artist whose life had been shattered by the same tragedy that had enriched him. "My wealth," he stated, the words costing him everything and yet freeing him, "is built on a foundation of profound sorrow. It is a monument to a ghost, and it is time to tear it down." He announced he was liquidating 70% of his personal assets and the majority stake in Finch Holdings. The sum was astronomical, enough to shake the foundations of the financial markets. With this fortune, he was establishing a new global foundation. "It will be called the Lily Vance Foundation for the Musical Arts," he announced, his voice cracking for the first time. "Its sole mission will be to put musical instruments into the hands of underprivileged children all over the world, to build schools where they can learn, to fund teachers who can nurture them, to ensure that no child who has music in their heart is ever silenced by poverty." It was a grand, staggering gesture of redemption, an act of financial self-immolation aimed at cauterizing a spiritual wound. But he was not finished. "This foundation requires a leader of unimpeachable moral and artistic authority," he continued. "A person who understands its mission not as a concept, but as a lived reality. Therefore, the foundation and its entire endowment will be placed under the exclusive control of its new chairman." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Mr. Elias Vance." The revelation sent another shockwave through the world. Elias, who had been watching the press conference from the quiet solitude of Mr. Sterling's office, was stunned. He had asked for nothing. He had not sought revenge or retribution. He only wanted to be left to his quiet grief. But Alistair was offering him not just an apology. He was offering him a purpose. He was offering him a way to make Lily's memory into a living, breathing force for good in the world. Alistair made one final stipulation, a condition he set for himself as a penance. "I have asked for one thing only," he told the silent press corps: "to be allowed to work for the foundation. In any capacity they will have me. To haul boxes, to answer phones, to do something, anything, that builds rather than breaks." Elias, after days of quiet contemplation, accepted. He did not do it for Alistair. He did not do it for himself. He did it for the little girl in the faded photograph, the girl who had made him promise he would never stop the music. He would not play for the world again, but he would ensure that thousands of other children could. It was a new kind of music, a new kind of composition. 2 years passed. The Lily Vance Foundation became a global phenomenon, a beacon of hope and creativity. It built gleaming music academies in inner-city neighborhoods and funded scholarships for prodigies discovered in forgotten corners of the world. The sound of music began to fill places where there had only been silence. The grand opening of the Foundation's flagship institution, the Lily Vance Music Hall in New York City, was a major event. The hall was an architectural marvel, designed for perfect acoustics, a temple dedicated to sound. Tonight, its first concert was to be given by a young girl from a rough neighborhood, a violin prodigy the foundation had discovered and nurtured. On the stage, bathed in a warm, respectful spotlight, stood Elias Vance. He was not there to perform. He was there as the foundation's chairman, his presence radiating a quiet, profound peace. The sorrow was still in his eyes, but it was no longer a hollow emptiness. It was a deep well of empathy and understanding. He looked out at the packed auditorium, at the faces of children, parents, donors, and music lovers, and he felt a sense of rightness that had eluded him for more than a decade. In the third row, sitting in an unassuming seat, was Alistair Finch. He wore a simple, off-the-rack suit. The icy gleam in his eyes was gone, replaced by a humble, quiet attention. He was no longer a titan of industry. He worked in the Foundation's logistics department, coordinating instrument shipments and managing school budgets. He was a functionary, a cog in the machine of redemption he had created. He had lost his fortune, his power, his name. But watching the hope on the faces in the crowd, he felt a sense of worth that $1 billion had never given him. He looked, for the first time in his adult life, at peace. Elias stepped to the microphone. His voice was calm and clear as he introduced the young violinist. He did not recount the story of that night at the hotel, nor the tragedy that bound him to Alistair. He spoke instead of the power of second chances. "Music has a unique power," he began, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "It can speak of joy and of sorrow. It can bridge the chasms between us. It reminds us that beneath the labels of rich and poor, powerful and weak, we are all just human, bound by the same hopes and the same capacity for pain." He paused, his eyes seeming to find Alistair's in the crowd for just a fleeting moment. We are often told that wealth is measured by what we accumulate, what we hold in vaults of steel or digital accounts. But I have learned that this is a falsehood. True wealth is not what we keep, but what we give away. It is not found in the cold gleam of gold, but in the warmth of a shared human connection, in the act of lifting someone else up. Its truest measure is found in the silent, resonant chambers of the human heart. He finished his speech and stepped back as the young violinist took center stage. As the first, beautiful notes from her violin filled the hall, Elias looked out across the audience. His gaze met Alistair's once more. There was no animosity, no lingering resentment. There was only a quiet, shared understanding. It was a nod of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of a terrible debt that could never be repaid, but was being atoned for, note by beautiful note. The music swelled, a melody not of sorrow, but of profound and resilient hope. It was the sound of a promise kept, of a new world order where a man's worth was finally measured not by the thickness of his wallet, but by the size of his heart. And in that shared glance, in that sacred music, two broken men found a quiet, unassuming form of grace.